So I had been here in Minnesota for several years. At that time was a chaplain at Metropolitan Medical Center and also at the Basilica. And we started hearing about gay lung and not sure what that all was and what the disease was. So kind of some of the same kind of questions were going on, and who did it affect and what it was about. Unlike today's pandemic that is extended to everybody, it affects everybody. It became really clear early on that this was a gay man's disease. It was very frightening. It was very frightening. And it tended to isolate even more a community in terms of LGBTQ and what that meant for that community, and either how society would respond or how the church would respond. Anytime a church or a society is faced with having to make a decision, you typically have two distinct responses. I was very proud. I remember at the time when I was at the Basilica and was asked to be on the original board of directors for Grace House. I was not here at Joan of Arc at that time, but I was very aware that this parish, Joan of Arc, was stepping forward with a very positive response that we would do all we could. So we took a part of our campus and we were going to dedicate it to HIV. That was a distinctly different response from a lot of other parishes that had little to do with it. So I knew at the time you could sort of see the divergence. You're either going to be a part of this or you're going to continue to be afraid and not respond to this. There was always a lot of concerns around how do we provide pastoral care and how do we maintain a hard line against gay people. So there was constantly that tension. And I can remember asking as we were knitting together the AIDS ministry program, the love the sinner, hate the sin approach is not going to go well. It's going to be not believable, and it's actually rather insulting. A very good friend of mine at that time, a gay man who was studying in a seminary, and there was, if you can think back to the pandemic and the fear that it had and the concerns and the sort of the death sentence that it seemed to have for people, the seminarian felt that he needed to go and talk with the people at the seminary. He was a student, and explained to them that he was HIV positive. And in the same meeting, it was said to him, how unfortunate, had you had cancer, we could have kept you. So he was dismissed from the seminary because he had HIV, and subsequently also was revealing that he was a gay person. So that's a pretty severe, hard story, but it described the fracture that you were trying to deal with. I'd say this became very real for a lot of us in 1984, 1985. Part of my work was to take a model of hospice care to do an HIV care team, because at that time it was uncertain as to what course of treatment people were wanting to take. So I and a nurse friend of mine developed an HIV care team to give people sort of a palliative care choice around whether or not you wanted to be actively treated for AIDS or take a comfort approach. For the longest time, there really was no choice. I was a chaplain at what was called Clinic 42, and it was a leading AIDS clinic here in the Twin Cities. I was very solidly involved in there from mid-'80s into the 90s. And my memories on that, in terms of treatment and working with the physicians and the team that worked, everybody died. Everybody died. It was just a matter of when. I think back on that more so certainly than this pandemic. How many friends, colleagues that I remember, to me personally, but just people who I was with professionally, who died. And how they've come back to me over the years. And now in this pandemic that we're in, I think about that experience and what that journey was. And there was something such a kindred spirit about it. I remember a couple from southern Minnesota who had come up and their son had died here in the cities. And they came up from rural Minnesota. And I met with them to provide some support and just to hold them at this time in which their son had died and died of AIDS. So I was accustomed to being with families who had lost a loved one and what one would anticipate would be most present to them in terms of their loss and what this would feel like. And the father presented with one and only one concern and feeling. And what he needed from me, and the reason he wanted to meet with me, was he thought I could give him some good advice on how to make sure when they returned their son's body to rural Minnesota to bury him, knowing that on the death certificate, AIDS would be there as the cause of death, the father needed to know how could that information be held from the people who buried their son, because they did not want that to be known. And I went through that with him and said, help me understand, is this truly where you're at right now? And it was truly where they were at. So of all the years' experience I'd had with people losing a loved one, that's really where the attention went. That was really the concern that they had. Churches didn't always do their best in situations like that. I remember as a gentleman I had worked with and journeyed with through Clinic 42. And his funeral was local. It was in a funeral home. And they had brought in their minister to do the funeral. And I attended the funeral. And as I was sitting there and the funeral continued to unfold and the minister, his almost closing sort of information to the family as he was preaching at their son's funeral was that it would be completely uncertain whether or not that their son would ever see God as a result of dying of AIDS as a gay man. And I remember I was sitting there in the congregation and I was all of a sudden standing up in front at the microphone, not having been invited, I was just up there all of a sudden. And he stepped aside and I corrected him. And I just commandeered the funeral for a few minutes to say that we need to hear an opposing opinion. And I said, this could not be further from the truth. And I would not be doing what I need to do if you were to leave here with that information. I'm here to tell you that's wrong. I think the larger church made some good efforts to provide good care. I think it managed to do it without having to really fundamentally change in terms of some of its teaching. And I think in some ways it received great and well-deserved accolades. The overwhelming work was done, as is often by people who were sitting in the churches and providing care. So similar, and also how it also affected me. Around 2000, I decided to learn more about HIV on an international basis. So we'd had a speaker here who had been to the International AIDS Conference in Durban, South Africa. I heard that in summer of 2000, and in the fall, I decided that I needed to go and wanted to learn more about HIV internationally. At that time, I was also interested to talk to the local churches there, because then and forever, HIV was, in South Africa, it was the epicenter for the entire world for HIV transmission. I spoke to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese and also the Anglican Archbishop in terms of what their experience was around HIV, because by this time I was coming up 16, 17 years of doing AIDS work here, and neither bishop could tell me the last time that they had been in the townships in Cape Town, South Africa, which told me neither large church denomination was really doing too much on the ground. So obviously this situation I talk about, the challenge, was worldwide in terms of what the larger churches, what difference they could make. That for me changed my life in terms of then connecting. HIV brought me to South Africa. It opened up the last 21 years for me and for many other people, not around necessarily HIV. HIV was a gift for me in that it brought me to Africa. Within 10 minutes of being there, you could easily see you cannot just go anywhere for HIV. So it was about housing, it was about healthcare, it was about education. So in retrospect, as I look back, the HIV journey for me has been eye-opening, and it's also opened up so much in my own life in terms of people wanting to do the right thing and make a difference. I'm very homesick for that. In the church and in the world that we're living in today, why would one not be homesick for those times in which people behaved magnificently? So maybe that's what I'm homesick for, is people now more than ever choosing to live and love magnificently despite what's going on around us, that we still make that choice. We did it 30 years ago. We've done it really throughout all of history. And I think we're called to that again.